Okay, we're going to get started now. I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Welcome to ICF's webinar entitled Municipal Smart Reliance Technology, Future-Ready Canadian Communities. My name is John Young. I'm one of the three co-founders and chairman of the Intelligent Community Forum. I'm also the Executive Director of ICF Canada, and I've taken many ICF and ICF Canada delegations around the world to learn about intelligent communities over the years. Co-founders also spend a great deal of time speaking about the intelligent community movement and its unique methodology at major speaking engagements around the world, including at TED Talks, at APEC, and even to the Nobel Prize winners. My own background is in urban planning, urban design, and economic development, so today's webinar is of special interest to me as well. If you're not familiar with us, the Intelligent Community Forum is two things. We're a global network of cities, metropolitan areas, and regions that ICF has recognized as intelligent communities. And through our network, we encourage our member communities to collaborate on economic and social development. But we're also a think tank. We study all aspects of the network of intelligent communities in order to discover through evidence-based data and analytics how these communities are using information and communications technologies, but not just to become an intelligent community, or a smart community rather, but on a more holistic perspective to build economic prosperity, address social challenges, which are often very difficult ones to bear, and to enrich their local cultures. We also look at building a knowledge workforce capable of prospering in the digital age, ensuring digital inclusion, building an ecosystem of innovation, and securing budgets and public policies that support intelligent community advocacy, as well as pursuing opportunities to ensure environmental sustainability and resiliency, the subject of today's webinar. We are best known for putting on annual awards. We call them the Intelligent Community Awards. The awards serve a critical purpose for us because they provide the data for our research, which we then use for our educational Community Accelerator program to share the best practices of the intelligent communities through our speeches, workshops, and the mentoring that we do. We also publish books, white papers, newsletters, and reports. We set up institutes for the study of the intelligent community. We study communities both globally and in their respective regions. We also set up national organizations in places where we have a cluster of intelligent communities, like ICF Canada and ICF Taiwan. Every year, we gather for the Intelligent Community Forum's Global Summit. This year, it will take place in London, England, from June 4th to the 6th. We hope to see you there. As of today, we have nearly 170 cities, metro areas, and regions. These are located on 6 continents, and they have a population ranging from 10,000 to 12 million people. We look at these cities, both large and small, and both rural and urban, in order to find and work with intelligent communities around the world. So you've heard me say the phrase intelligent communities now a few times. But what is it all about? Well, we say that intelligent communities are communities that, in an age of digital disruption, are using today's digital tools to build inclusive prosperity, solve social issues, and enrich our community's cultures. Before I introduce our speakers, I just have a couple of housekeeping points. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. You can submit your questions to us via text using the Questions tab on your control panel. A recording of this webinar is taking place and will be available on our website in the next coming days. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, you might want to write this down. There are some technical support numbers that are available should you run into any problems viewing this webinar. And now, I would like to introduce our presenters. Alexander Hay is the founding principal of Southern Harbor, and Nick Martin is the founder and CEO of RiskLogic. I will now hand over the floor to them, and I'll be right back after their presentations in order to work through the question and answer session. So, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. I just have a thing to do here. And everybody should now see a slide which shows a picture of a city with the header, "Trillions of dollars at risk." And I realize that people are dialing in from around the world, so please substitute that dollar sign with the currency of your country.
Nick, we're actually, sorry, this is Matt. We're actually seeing, it looks like you're not in presentation mode. We're just seeing your slides as well as your notes.
Okay.
There we go. Now we're good.
We good? Here we are.
Yep, we're all set now. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. My name's Nick Martin. I'm the founder and CEO of RiskLogic, and I will be speaking to you for a minute or two, and then I will hand over to my colleague Alec Hay. What I would like to do is set the scene for our presentation and pick up on one or two themes that John has expounded on in our opening. Now, it's no surprise to anybody who has dialed into this webinar that 80% of the world's population is living in or around a city. And cities now represent an extremely high concentration of value. What goes on in a city now far exceeds the value of the city itself in terms of its properties. That represents trillions and trillions of dollars that are now at risk to such things as climate change, extreme weather events, cyber attacks, and all sorts of other hazards listed below. So flooding, wildfire, space weather, which we don't talk about very much, seismic effects, ice storms, and tornadoes, to name but a few. Now, all of the cities that are certainly in the ICF portfolio are, as John said, attempting to use disruptive digital technologies to improve the life of their citizens, to improve the efficiency of their services, and to make it easier for their economies to flourish. But as we saw in Houston this year, and as we have seen over the last decade in various cities around the world, extreme weather events can nullify the effect of the intelligent community pretty quickly. And what that tells us is that an intelligent community that is not resilient is not really going to prosper for very long when faced with extreme weather events or cyber attacks. So what we want, so increasingly, global civic leaders are asking these three questions. How do we make the economy and our society in our city resilient to all of these effects, some of which are unquantified? Then if we're going to make investments in resilience, how do we balance those investments with the risk? Which is to say, how do we ensure that the money we spend will actually answer the problem and mitigate the risk? And finally, of course, the whole question of evidence. What is the evidence that this is actually going to make us more resilient? What is the evidence that we are actually under threat? So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Alec, who's going to talk about resilience and his work at the Center for the Resilience of Critical Infrastructure. Alec, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Hello. The definition of operational resilience that you see before you is what one that has been used now for the best part of a decade at the University of Toronto Centre for Resilience of Critical Infrastructure, to establish a common baseline against which several strands of research could be conducted, specifically around the increasing complexity of the different infrastructure systems as they influence the capacity of a city to not only support normal life and economy, but also to have the capacity to absorb the effects of shocks and stresses and to self-recover as rapidly as possible. And in this, we can't confuse resilience with robustness. Robustness is not an active property, a characteristic. It's a passive one. It is the ability to absorb the effects of shocks and stresses. It is not the ability to recover. And in this respect, resilience is unique. We see it in ecology, how ecosystems will adapt to a changing environment and conditions, and they will also recover. We see it in many other different aspects, even the human body. So the concept of resilience being able to absorb and respond to, but also to recover as rapidly as possible, is something that is consistent across all boards. If you look at how our world is changing, we should really think of it in terms of trends. It can be slightly misleading talking about climate change. The climate is changing, absolutely, and there are multiple causes of climate change. The effect of human beings is by no means the only cause. But the issue here is that it is causing a trend in consequence. See, extreme events have been with us for many, many years, for as long as humanity has been on the planet. The point is that we've either been so dispersed or had so little, relatively speaking, to lose, that these catastrophic events have not cost in social and economic terms as much as they do today. Also, as we become more populated, we're experiencing more of these events. 100 years ago, nobody would have noticed a microburst that happened in the boreal forests of Canada. But today, when that microburst happens a little further south in a populated area, it has a direct effect. And so consequently, we are looking at these trends in weather patterns and climate in terms of what they mean to us. And the three graphs at the top there, they're taken from the Canadian Disaster Database. And they show the number of instances of catastrophic events over a period from 2080 through to the 2014. Now, over that period, you can see there is this, some people refer to it as a hockey stick curve. There's this general trending increase in what those catastrophic events mean. But that is the consequence of those events. If we look at malicious threats, and there's a couple of images there on the bottom of a terrorist event or public disorder, the issue there is that irrespective of what measures are put in place, they assume a level of risk. There is a threshold of risk that is underlying that, above which we aren't investing in protecting against it. So when the Twin Towers were attacked by terrorists, that exceeded that threshold of what we considered a worthwhile investment at the time. And that will always be the case. it is always possible to exceed a level of protection. No protection can be absolute. Now, the last point, though, is about the trend in technology, and particularly information and communication technology. As has already been alluded to, this has fundamentally changed the way we live, and it has concentrated value into ever smaller areas. So much so that quite often the value of the infrastructure becomes a rounding error in the value of the operation that it enables. Now, this hasn't happened in history before, and it is something that is of particular concern, because while we still, in our practice and in our legislation and our codes of practices, we still emphasize the asset over the operation, in fact, the operation has primacy. The operation is the value. And we need to be very clear about what we are therefore trying to make resilient. The other interesting point about the technological change, though, is that while it is concentrating value and it has therefore made consequence of an event reasonably foreseeable, so there really is no excuse for ignorance when it comes to what does this event mean. We can't predict the likelihood of an event, but we can say that if a particular aspect, a particular asset or function fails, what that means for the operation as a whole, what that means for the city corporation, the municipal corporation, and its ability to support its citizens. That is very easy now to map out. And so technology is providing both the accelerator of consequence, but it's also providing us the opportunity to address it. And when you look at sustainability, it's affected by the same thing. Now, looking at community resilience as a whole, there are many aspects to community resilience, not least how human beings react to particular events. But it is enabled through operational resilience. And when you consider operational resilience in the round, it focuses very much at a municipal level on whether the municipal corporation can deliver what is expected of it during times of stress. So put very simply, if the fire station is in a floodplain and it's expected to be able to respond when the area is flooded, it won't be able to respond because it is underwater. It is not resilient. The capacity, the capability of the municipality to support when it is needed has been lost. When we unpack operational resilience, we need to understand how the different infrastructure systems correlate. And next slide, please. When we look at the domains of civilization, we see that 3 of them are infrastructure systems. Each of those 3 infrastructure systems is enabled and used by the human dimension. That's the human behavior that determines whether or not something can happen. Now, when all 4 domains are in balance, we have resilience. But their interaction represents the value of the whole. So if you were to look at a city, how all of these 4 domains interact can be said to be the value of that city, the value that that society represents. The built domain of infrastructure is possibly the one that we're most familiar with. Everything that we have built, our houses, roads, streets, the water utilities, power utilities, and so on, that is all built. So is the internet. The natural infrastructure, this is the natural world around us as it pertains to what we wish to do, as it pertains to what enables our operation to continue. So, for example, we may use a river as a navigation, which allows us to transport goods up and down the river. the river is also a source of water, and it's incorporated into our water supply, things like that. And then the virtual domain are all those systems and infrastructures that we choose to be constrained by. So, for example, a virtual infrastructure is money. There is no intrinsic value in a dollar bill or some change, or even in gold. But we ascribe a value to it, and we trust that when we hand this over, we will be given that intrinsic value in return. So our laws, our codes of practice, these are all virtual infrastructures. The organizational structure of who we communicate with and who we answer to and our accountabilities and so on, these are all virtual infrastructures. And when you bring all of these four domains together, that is how a city functions. It is how any organization functions. And it isn't the cost of each domain that is the value. It is its ability to deliver the purpose of that community. Every city has a vibrancy, a functionality, a purpose. And how those domains support that purpose through shocks and stresses will define its true value. But every community has its own relationship with infrastructure. So the infrastructure systems enable the economy of the community, of the municipality. But the municipality stresses those infrastructure systems because every city is a dynamic being. The demands on resources, they move. There might be business startups or new developments and things like that. But the infrastructure systems are just conduits. They transmit resources, and the resources are what are consumed to enable the economy. And so consequently, as the city lives and breathes, it is always placing stress on the infrastructure system. If there is a new development, it will be supported by a branch of the existing infrastructure systems. It's very rare for a city to rip up its infrastructure and relay it just for a new development. It's not unheard of, but it's extremely rare. But every city, every community will have a relationship with common infrastructure. And this enabling infrastructure is known as the critical infrastructure. It is critical because it enables the essential functionality of each community, of each business, each operation. And so within that equilibrium, we have multiple communities with their own relationships with the same infrastructure, and therefore they have to have relationships with each other. Now this, for those of you who are familiar with Elinor Ostrom's work on governing the commons, she was a Nobel laureate who espoused the ideas of self-governing systems around a common resource. You'll find that the dynamics are very, very similar. So you can have several cities that will, through necessity, rebalance their relationship with infrastructure between themselves because they are drawing off the same infrastructure. But in all of this, you have developments, and so it needs some kind of strategic framework that allows each city to recognize what its constraints and limitations are. And that would be, in this case, would say by the provincial government or regional government or something like that. But this concept of equilibrium also allows us to work out what the consequences are of an event. So, for example, when we look at the municipality, an ice storm hits the municipality continues to function. It can be stressed, but the essential functionality of that municipality continues. Conversely, the same event hitting the infrastructure is a shock, because when the power lines come down, the power ceases to flow. And as a result, we say that it is shocked. and that indirectly applies a stress to the municipality. Now, how the municipality deals with those consequences will define its inherent resilience to those events. But the population are just stressed by a loss of power. It is not something that becomes critical unless it extends for a longer duration. But this begs the question of what makes us fragile. Why might we fail under a shock or a stress? And when we look at fragility, our fragility is more often than not defined by what we need to use our resources on instead of responding and recovering. So if we look at the incident sequence and we follow that through, we're going along at a routine level of performance. An event happens, our performance drops to virtually zero. We then have a reaction, and the reaction is what brings us to a minimum operating capability. This is our survival level, nothing more. The reaction is blind. It is irrespective of what has caused the failure, but the point is we can stay alive. And everything that those essential functions depend upon is known as critical. So the infrastructure that enables a fire station to continue to function and to communicate will be considered critical. We then go through a period of response, and the response period brings us up to a stable level, the minimum sustainable capability, and that needs to, or that is defined by where the organization is not making money, it's not growing, it's not developing, but it's not losing either. It's not depopulating. It's not losing money. It's stable. Now, public confidence, market confidence, and operational tolerance says that we have to be stable within a certain period of time. And for most commercial enterprises, that period, that planning point, is 8 a.m. next business day. So it is quite conceivable that the city is still flooded, but the expectation is that it will be functional by the following day. It will be at a stable level. It will be under control. So when we put that together, we can work out what resources we need, what capability we need for the reaction, for the response, and indeed for the recovery. And then all the resources, all the capacity that is then taken up. For example, keeping the vulnerable safe and secure, for example, or providing heating in community housing and things like that. Those take up resources that would otherwise be used for response and recovery. And so as part of that investment in resilience, we would be looking at how do we make the vulnerable, the community housing, things like that, how do we make that self-reliant? How do we enable them to continue to be safe and secure and warm and so on and so forth during the essential period that we need to use the same resources for our own reaction and response? And when you balance those investments, quite often the return on investment is measured in months. It is not measured in years. I'll hand you over to Nick again now, and he can explain some of the tools that we use to work this out.
Thanks, Alec. So, as I mentioned, smart communities, intelligent communities, are not necessarily resilient communities. But our posit today is that they can be. And there are smart tools to enable all of that. And in order to exemplify what I'm talking about, I need to approach the current tool set and describe how most risk analysts will go at the risks posed by these hazards when they do resilience assessments of your communities. The top left-hand part of my diagram contains what is fondly known as a heat map, and it emerges from the ISO 31000, sometimes known as enterprise risk management. And up the vertical axis are likelihood scores, and across the horizontal axis are consequences. And what is common is you will begin with an expert panel that will elicit the types of hazards contemplated, and that will form what is called a risk register. And most of the risk register statements begin with, there is a risk that there may be a flood, there is a risk that we will have a hailstorm, there is a risk that so on and so forth. Now, there are several challenges to this approach because it is not initially evidence-based usually. Now, each of the hazards are then assessed for the consequence, what will happen when or if there is the hazard manifests, and it is given a score and placed in one of those quadrants. And if it is a high likelihood and high consequence event in the minds of the experts, then it will show up in the red quadrants in the top right-hand corner. Now, there is no limit to the number of hazards that can be identified, and they are classified similarly and placed in the quadrants. And then risk owners are assigned, people who are whose responsibility it is to mitigate the effects of those risks, and they do so generally in isolation. So we end up with a series of folks, all well-meaning, setting out to solve a problem with no understanding whatsoever of the unintended consequences on the other risks in the quadrants of their actions to try and solve their own assigned problem. So there are several problems and several challenges with this approach. First of all, likelihood is unknowable. Secondly, as we've seen from the outset of this presentation, we are in an era of change, unpredictable, the magnitude is unknowable, and where and when is certainly unknowable at the moment. Change is the enemy of probability. We're using the idea of a probability or a likelihood of occurrence to calibrate our model, and we are doing it in an era of change where that is even less knowable than it was to begin with. So there are some, should we say, cracks in the foundation of the methodology. Now, as many of you listening to us will know, risk is an ecosystem of dependent factors, things which act upon each other to create a risk, not things that create risks in and of themselves. And in ISO 31000, there is no way to represent that or to understand it. Now, to add to this is the frustrating factor of dynamism. Risks move. They change over time. As we change the infrastructure in our cities, so the risk mitigation factors will change. As the economy changes, as informational technology changes, so the risk environment changes. And in ISO 31000, there is no way to reflect that either. Further frustrating this method is the idea of risk velocity. Risks don't happen instantaneously and they don't disappear instantaneously. They occur over time. And understanding that velocity has an awful lot to do with how we posture our response and recovery assets and how we address each of the risks. And finally, of course, risk has a cost, a large cost in some cases, as Houston is finding out now. Understanding that cost helps us to make decisions about the return on investment we can expect from mitigations. Currently, we see a trend towards uninformed mitigations where we end up euphemistically sometimes spending $20 million to solve a $2 million problem. What we seek, of course, is the $2 million solution to the $20 million problem. So really, this method is an abacus. It's fairly good, but it is not definitive. And we're going to look at another method which may in fact hold the intelligent community solution to defining resilience. What we need is a smart system of systems tools, a system that expresses our infrastructure in a city, and this is a small extract from the city of Toronto, as a series of connections which are mathematically connected so we can understand their dependency. The basic concept is rooted in what we call graph theory. It's a branch of combinatorial mathematics, and it uses entities, the boxes you can see here, that have two scores. The one on the left is for the impact of the entity on the whole, and the one on the right is the likelihood of failure of that particular entity. Not the likelihood that something will occur, but the likelihood that under stress it will fail. And those are called nodes. The lines which connect them are called edges, and they also have a mathematical value. An edge describes the propagation of an effect from one node to another. You will notice that some nodes have two arrows, one upstream and one downstream, and you notice that the scores are different. What that indicates is that the upstream node conveys a very strong propagation of effect to the downstream node, but the downstream node does not convey the same amount of impact upstream. And that's quite common in infrastructure relationships. But let's see what happens as we build this out. I'm going to use an example here of an event which occurred in Toronto in 2013, where 90 millimeters of precipitation were experienced in 3 hours. The precipitation overwhelmed the ability of the stormwater management system, and there were a massive series of consequences. What you're looking at here is a customized geospatial package called Geologic, and down the left-hand side you can see a series of infrastructure elements listed, and each of them are represented by the green dots you can see within the light green polygon on the map. Key points on the ground to pay attention to: the Don River, and you can see Basin Power Station and Ashbridges Bay Wastewater Treatment Plant, and you can see a picture of it. Now, the entities in the map I just showed you are depicted in the orange area to the lower right-hand side of this dependency graph, and it is connected through all of these dependency nodes to the City of Toronto infrastructure. Point here being that you can see an exploded view of a neighborhood connected to a city's infrastructure. Technically, this model is not restricted. It can be as big as it needs to be. The City of Toronto infrastructure in that model has nearly 13,000 entities in it. Now, when we plot this as a heat map, which is data-driven by that model, what we can see is local power distribution, the Basin Station, and Ashbridges Bay arranged on a model which talks about their inherent risk. Where do they sit in a control framework that represents the operation of the city on any given day? And when we plot them for inherent risk, which ones are at the greatest risk, we can see here that the local power distribution, the electrical substation, food processing and distribution, and the wastewater treatment plant all play out as increasingly high risk or inherent risk in the operations of the City of Toronto on a given day. So what we can say is, by knowing the cost of each one of those infrastructures, that there are 69 example entities, and the value at risk on any given day is $7,689,382. These are notional costs, by the way. Now, on the 13th, in September 2013, there was a massive flood, and you can see that is depicted by the purple polygon in the middle. Basin substation failed, and the first order effects were propagated through the city, and you can see that with the orange indications for the infrastructures that were immediately affected. We can go directly into the actual substation itself and find out why that failed, and it depends the degree of accuracy we need for a model, but this is done in 3 dimensions, simply to say that a power station doesn't fail in one unit. It is some subcomponent of the power station that fails, and so we can look inside the power station and understand what fails and what doesn't. The top graphic on the right-hand side shows the power station in stasis, and the bottom graphic is what happens when water gets into the turbines and fails the industrial control systems and the generators themselves. So the second order failures is where things get very interesting. Although the wastewater treatment plant did in fact have backup electricity from generators, it didn't function as it was supposed to. Consequently, there was a sewage backup through a large area, and that's shown by the orange polygon, through a large area of Toronto, which backed sewage up into people's basements and into businesses, even though they had sewage backup preventers in a lot of cases. The pressure was so great that it was some of our firemen friends in Toronto were telling us that manholes were being blown 20 feet into the air because of the back pressure. The ultimate result, of course, is that a building which is inundated with sewage is now on a time clock. There is 72 hours to mitigate that, or the building is very likely to be condemned as a public health hazard. Consequently, all the resources from not only Toronto, but around Ontario and Eastern Canada, and some from the States, were marshaled to deal with this, so there wasn't a massive loss of housing stock. That drastically affected the city recovery capability. The evaluation or the cost of that hazard we can see as $18,828,236. That's a useful figure, and I'll come back to it in a minute. So how could this be mitigated? As I started to say, our civic leaders are faced with the challenge of what can we do about it. It's all very well and good to know about it, but unless we come with a solution, we're not actually adding value to the process. Unfortunately, Basin Substation and a large part of the City of Toronto electrical infrastructure is not on a smart grid. It is growing, but it isn't fully there yet. The solution would be to add 3 new remote ICS substations at $100,000 each, to add an industrial control for $75,000, and that gives us a mitigation cost of $375,000. So when we add these together, we can see that the value at risk initially was $7,689,000. The profile of the hazard was $18 million, and the mitigation is a mere $375,000. That is the kind of information which is evidence-based, repeatable, and auditable that decision makers can use to accelerate such things as smart grid proliferation across the electrical grid of Toronto, with a full understanding of what the return on investment will be. I'm going to hand back to Alec for a second to talk about his book, After the Flood, which explains this all in a very understandable and easy narrative. Alec?
Okay, the book was written for students on the postgraduate course doing urban and infrastructure planning and resilience planning, and it provides it in story form, so making it as accessible as possible without any without the technical jargon or anything else like that. It's just to explain what the concepts are. It's available in various libraries and so on. So it's just, if this is an area that you would be interested in looking at in more detail, that there are references out there that can sum it up for you. Back to you.
So I'll conclude our comments and hand it back to John in a second, simply to say that the mayhem which is conveyed by these graphs and diagrams, and which we perceive as what is coming down the pipe towards us in the future, is actually manageable. It's understandable. And we think that through the application of smart technologies to the resilience of communities, not only to the economy and the social well-being, that we can make global communities future ready. John, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you, Alec. And Nick, it was a very valuable presentation. I learned quite a lot, and I would like to encourage any of the attendees to send us your questions. I have a few here now, but please go to your control box and in the text area, write us a question if you have any for Alexander Hay and Nick Martin. I have a couple of questions though. You know, what I'd like to know is, you know, you spoke about this example in Toronto, and you know, how much data does this approach require in order to actually give a valid result?
I'll take that one, Alex, shall I?
Mm-hmm.
So it would appear that one needs an awful lot of data, and as we all know, we're averse to data-hungry monsters because of the amount of effort they take, and to some degree the limited value that they produce. This isn't the case here. All the data that we used for that model was available in open source. Secondly, all the data that a city produces is the data that would be used to construct this model anyway. So we're not generating new data. What we're doing is mining for data that already exists. For example, we know the capital asset value of every component in a power plant. That is well documented. All we need to do is hoover that up, take the CAD or the paper drawings of the power plant, and through the magic of some of our software, we create the model, assign the or classify the elements in the power plant, assign the costs, and the model runs. And that is probably no more than a day's effort if we want to go to that level. At the community level, larger infrastructure is known. We know what value a piece of infrastructure produces. We know what it supports. We know what is connected to it because the engineering has already been done. We know which houses depend upon, or which businesses depend upon which power plants. So everything needed to construct these models is well known. It's just held in silos for particular purposes and isn't joined up. What we're doing is joining it across the 10 infrastructure verticals, which are practiced in our country. There are 16 in the US and 8 in the UK. It joins them up, so it creates a network model of dependencies, and then we can understand what the net effect of a hazard on all of those infrastructures is. I hope that answers the question.
I do have a variation on that question. Does trust come into any of this? The trust in the data, a potential issue?
Well, no more than it does with the data that already exists. Certainly there's a trust. If you're talking about do we trust the data, then it's the same data that is used to calculate tax rolls, to do land management, to manage the cadastre, all sorts of reasons. So there is no greater or lesser trust in the data than for this purpose than there is for any other purpose. If you're referring to the trust in the people making the model, yes, there is very definitely a trust, a bond that has to be created. Now, we don't suggest that this should be done by external third parties at all points. We think that it is best done as a build, operate, transfer model, so that experts can help a city build the model, but the city has to own the model and to evolve it over time. Mostly the staff to do this already exist. They're just doing other things. And the city, of course, has its own trust assurance mechanisms for the data that would be collected and concentrated in this model. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So how long would it normally take to implement something like this?
On a large global city, you're looking at the work of months to establish an initial control framework, but it's the work of years to mature it and use it and continue to ingest it as a decision support tool. It never stops. As Alec pointed out, no resilience is ever complete. So it doesn't get done and then we sort of wash our hands of it and say, well, job done, on to the next thing. This evolves into a core decision support tool set and method for all sorts of resilience decision making, and of course, as you can see, it has other uses. And by that I mean emergency services planning. It should become an integral part of the city planning methodology.
So in the case of Toronto, you mentioned Toronto, they just hired their first chief resiliency officer, and there are many other cities like Melbourne, Australia, that have one as well. So they should already be working on things like this, but have you worked with resiliency officers to be able to achieve success? Could you give us a couple of examples of communities that you've worked with, or where they either exist or they should actually have them?
We've met Elliot on several occasions, and he's just new in his post and has a steep uphill climb in the city of Toronto. But as the attendees will know, the Rockefeller Resilient 100 Cities Challenge put in place 100 new resilience officers in these cities across the globe. And that is with the objective of kick-starting the discussion about resilience and all their processes. We have been to the R100 offices in New York and had a long conversation with them. And they see this as one of the disruptive technologies that will be gradually incorporated into the R100 program. Now, nothing happens quickly, and there are vested interests and also a fair amount of effort required to understand what we are proposing, and not view it as a threat to incumbent processes and positions. So it's a gradual process. We have, ironically, more success in international communities than we do in Canada at the moment. We've just recently returned from the Gaza Strip, and we've been working for the International Committee of the Red Cross, where this capability is increasingly understood, and there may be opportunities and requirements, in fact, to apply it in a wider range of communities than just Gaza. So
how do communities work with an organization like yourselves? How do they get in touch with you, and what are the kind of first steps that you would do working with them to create success in what they would think in their communities?
Well, our website, www.risklogic.com, that's risklogic.com, is a good place to start. There are some white papers and things there, and also we can be directly contacted for further information. In terms of how we would implement, generally speaking, there is a long discovery process to undergo. We need to fully understand the context and the problem before we launch into anything that resembles a resilience study. But once that context is understood, then generally we will undergo a resilience study of the city to create the control framework and take it from there through all of the risk exposures and, of course, the mitigations. Our objective, of course, is to ensure that the community itself embraces the whole process and doesn't depend on us to do it for them. So to us, success is achieved when we can walk away, obviously being on the end of the telephone tether if necessary, but that the community takes the opportunity to embrace smart technologies for resilience, which we believe and which the UNISDR has stated, resilience is the precursor and the prerequisite to sustainable development.
I have a question that somebody sent to us from, it looks like in the United States. The question goes as follows. How do you know that there might be potential net neutrality changes that the FCC may make in the United States that will impact risk and the risk environment in the U.S.? Can you take a shot at that particular question?
Net neutrality is going to affect the quality of internet bandwidth and the type of service providers one can access. It is going to pose somewhat of a risk of limiting information available to the commons. But in terms of what we're doing, it's unlikely to restrict it. The impact will be really on folks' choice in the kind of service that they require or that they engage in their internet interaction. Impact on the industrial control systems of cities will probably be minimal. It's as yet unclear as to what the impact on the Internet of Things is going to be. But again, cities who depend on IoT for their industrial control systems and so on are likely to purchase the service necessary to continue to operate those systems in secure environments. So all in, I'm not sure there will be an awful lot of risk posed by that. Alec, do you have something to add?
No, I agree completely. I think all the challenges or the perceived challenges of net neutrality are really questions of access rather than the content and the validity of the evidence that's collected. So certainly the way it's being discussed at the moment, I do not perceive any real issues.
So I have two quick questions before we end. One is that you indicated that the current tools are not adequate. What about as artificial intelligence becomes much more possible with advanced technology? Do you see that there may be a time when there will be some tools that will be out there for communities to undertake on a more regular basis? Or do you see that they still need the support of humans to regularly monitor and devise solutions?
So this has hit my favorite topic at the moment. So when we look at AI and what it can do for us, especially in this environment, we have to deconstruct it a little bit. We need to think about supervised machine learning, unsupervised or non-supervised machine learning, and then at the apex, consider AI, which is completely autonomous. The real impact that AI can have on us is to make the data acquisition and its classification and so on much less onerous. It's not that onerous at the moment, but it certainly requires what we call human in the loop, or HITL. Ultimately, human in the loop cannot be removed from this. It must not be removed from this. These are our communities, and if we do not take personal and direct interest in how they run, what the risks to them are, and we were to delegate this responsibility to autonomous AI-driven systems, then we have ceded our community sovereignty to the cyber world, and that is a very dangerous thing to do. Can we use non-supervisory machine learning to help in the more labor-intensive tasks of collecting data, verifying it, classifying it, associating it? Absolutely, and we're working on that. An example I would use is we're about to make the site logic tool, which I alluded to, the ability to look inside a particular piece of critical infrastructure and understand how it functions and the sequence of its failures. We're about to make that into a 4-dimensional virtual reality tool, and there will be elements of non-supervisory machine learning involved in that. There are other applications, but I think probably for today I've answered the question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. One last question, and we'll need to wrap up. The presentation is going to be recorded and available, but how do they reach you if anybody here would like to utilize your services?
Well, for me, as I've mentioned, there's the website, risklogic.com. You can reach me personally at nick nick.martin@risklogic.com. There's a Y in there, M-A-R-T-Y-N. And Alec, your contact details are at the university, yes?
Yes, you can either go to www.southernharbour.net and contact me through Southern Harbour, or directly to the university at all lowercase alec.hay@utoronto.ca.
Well, thank you, Alexander and Nick. ICF's webinar on smart reliance technologies, future-ready Canadian communities, is now at an end, and I'd like to thank you both for your time and a wonderful presentation. I'd like to also thank all of the attendees. We look forward to having you at our next webinar. We are going to be posting this soon. It's on December 12th. It's called the Gigabit Networks After Google. We also will be undertaking a number of other initiatives over the next couple of months. In February, we'll have our top 7 intelligent communities announced. We'll send out information about the location and the actual date that will take place shortly. Then we hope you attend our summit in London from June 4th to the 6th. It will be a fantastic event in the area of London that some of you are very familiar with. We'll be in the Canary Wharf area at Siemens Crystal Building, and we hope to have a very engaging couple of days there. On June 6th, we'll actually be awarding the Intelligent Community of the Year. That's usually a very exciting time. And on June 18th, on ICF's website, we'll post a very unique new listing. It's called the World's Top 100 Intelligent Communities. So we look forward to having you all participate with us on these events, and we look forward to having you be part of our December 12th webinar. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing from you again. Bye for now.